Thank you so much for, can you hear me well?
I can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for the invite. Very happy to be here with you all.
I love your backdrop.
Say again?
I love your backdrop.
Yes, yes. This is Lina Bobardi's house, one of my favorite architects.
Wonderful, wonderful. So you're an architect, an educator,
yes,
and a deep time thinker. And what's one thing you can suggest that we should explore in our effort to reform the prevailing paradigm of short-termism?
Yeah, so my answer goes from more abstract to more concrete, and it actually, the more abstract side of it, the biggest challenge to me is the need to bring a new level of consciousness to the way we humans relate. Well, first of all, of course, to each other, but then the way to relate with the planet. And so we need to enter a deeper state of knowing or of consciousness that take us out of a state of alienation in which I think we are currently immersed. So that's the more abstract side of it. I think that for a very long time, we have been operating as if nature is something that is different from us, as a resource from which we can take. And I like, for me as an architect, I see that in the way we construct, we get our materials, and so it relates a bit with what it has been said before in terms of ways of being more conscious about maintenance, about where materials come from and where are they produced and processed and where they are going to end up. And so we need to understand that nature is not different from us, that we are part of that nature. And to me, this understanding comes from the learning of thinking simultaneously to different types of time. So here we are talking a lot about long-term thinking, but I think it's real. The difficulty is how to think together human timescales and planetary timescales. I think that's the big challenge, that when we think one, we forget the other one. No? And I think this global climate crisis that we are facing, for example, short-term environmental urgencies coexist with deep existential planetary concerns, right? And so we are forced to toggle between the timescales of the urgent now and the timescales of the deep future. And I think this is what we should really understand, that both scales are part of us, and to understand that in the more shallow times, the human condition that emerges is that where we are individual humans with conscious agency that is deployed around issues of equity, of race, of justice. But then in the deep timescales, I think we have been operating like as a collective element, and that has been unconscious, right? Like kind of, and that unconsciousness is the thing that I feel needs to be addressed with this other level of consciousness. The reason why I think the human timescales is important to keep is because that will allow us to see that issues of equity, of justice, of uneven responsibility associated with climate change are important, because we have to understand that the more advanced industrialized nations have been the major producers of CO2, for example, while poor underdeveloped countries have been far more vulnerable and affected by the consequences. And so the less abstract part of the answer, I guess, that goes to CO2. And I think that we need to urgently address the levels of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. I think that is not only causing climate change, but deep imbalances in the earth, in the planet, acidification of oceans, disappearance of coral reefs, extinction of species, and of course the emergence of climate disasters. And so I think we need to rapidly transition to non-fossil types of energy. So somehow it's this kind of new consciousness that will lead us to better decisions. And one of these decisions that I think should be there at the front is the CO2 reduction.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Cristina. I'm curious, you know, the cornerstone of the ideas you're articulating there is this notion of changing consciousness, which of course is hard to do in an effective way. But while you were speaking, I was struck by, you know, when you look at cultures around the world, one of the interesting things to observe culture to culture is the notion of self. Where do individuals define themselves, and where do the boundaries? Is it literally them as a person, or is their sense of themselves actually very deeply embedded in a community or a family or a faith tradition? And different cultures deal with that issue in different ways, but you can see across different cultures, like certain cultures have a much stronger individualistic sense of self, and others have this broader, more integrated sense of self. And while you were speaking, I was thinking of extending that sense of self when it's more broadly integrated into the future selves, obviously future generations to come, people who are not yet alive. And in a sense, that's maybe one way to deal with that change of consciousness. Of course, very easy to say, but how to do it in reality, I don't know. I mean, as an educator, is education the principal way to move in the right direction there? Obviously, there's multiple tools, but is education the main one from your point of view, or something else?
No, I mean, I think education is one of it. It's like the idea of exposing us, and I say us because I consider myself a student at the same time as I am teaching, like kind of we are all learning at the same time, but I think exposing us to other cultures, as you are saying, for example, thinking about the 7 generations, or because I think it's a way of relating with future generations, but also the way other cultures relate with Mother Earth, with the planet, right? And so, for example, in architecture, now bringing ways of constructing like more vernacular approaches to architecture, where you were like kind of build with local materials, for example. I think these are ways of bringing consciousness in a very practical way, right? Like kind of it doesn't sound so so abstract in a way, but I do think that that the planet, that the more than human and the human to human ways in which we relate need to be definitely revised, and we should learn from other cultures and from future propositions as well.
Excellent. A lot to think about there, Cristina. Thank you so much. Appreciate your reflections. So let's next come to Jay Hughes, bioethicist, sociologist, change maker, and as I recall, also an avid science fiction fan. Jay, what's the one hard problem you think we need to focus on if we are going to be successful in making forward progress to a thriving long-term future?
Well, you mentioned science fiction, so at the outset, I'll just invite you all to watch Foundation, the new TV series based on Isaac Asimov's novels, which is coming out this month, which is, I think, the original science fiction idea of the Long Now Foundation. It's a multi-thousand-year project to save civilization from itself. But the problem that I picked for your topic is one that's much on my mind as a parent and as a child, because I have two 20-something kids who I desperately would like to breed, and so that I could have grandchildren, because I would like to have grandchildren. And they have the same malaise about having children that many people of their generation do. And at the other end of life, I have 94-year-old in-laws who are demented and who need 24-hour care. And so the issue that I want to address is old age dependency ratio, or the combination of the global birth dearth and silver tsunami that is going to have many impacts on us. We already, I think, see in places like Japan and increasingly in China, the economic malaise that's created by the combination of a falling fertility rate and extended life expectancy. And I think we're going to see increasingly the kind of generational warfare that we saw last year from, for instance, people saying seniors should just accept that they need to die to save the economy, that COVID was just something that was going to affect people over 65, so who cares? That I think will increasingly be a dynamic in our political discussions. At the same time that COVID was driving down fertility around the world because the future became more uncertain and people didn't want to bring kids into the world. So the answers that I have to those two things are: one, make it easier to have kids by creating social policies like free childcare through free higher education that both in China, the United States, and in Europe are one of the major concerns that child rearing age people have about why they may or may not have kids. And then at the old age continuum, I think we all want to live longer. It's the living longer is not the problem. It's the disability that comes with old age that's the problem. And I think we have the prospect now of developing through government-funded research programs, technologies, therapies that could extend healthy longevity for a decade or more. And that would not ultimately solve these problems, but it would push them off a little bit and give our social welfare states room to breathe. And just to wrap all that up, I think as we become an older, grayer society, and the prospects of, we know that millennials and Zoomers have less wealth and are going to face a lot longer without wealth until they inherit from seniors who are going to die a lot later. And so we need a more equitable society generationally. We need to extend Medicare to everyone. We need to have universal health care. And we need to have something like Social Security for everyone so that we all have the kind of economic security that comes with that kind of a policy. So I think that's a lot to wrap into the idea of old age dependency ratio, but it is something that's on my mind a lot.
Yeah, no, terrific. A lot in there, as with all our speakers. So we could talk for an hour just with each one of the speakers here. I'm curious, in particular, thinking about the issue of, breeding age folks, younger folks who decide not to have kids for myriad reasons. Are there sort of welfare-oriented, policy-oriented approaches that you suggested? Are they really likely to shift significantly? What I'm thinking of, the folks I know a number of people who have elected not to have children for these sort of social conscious or awareness reasons. And I'm not sure that any of them would change their mind if we made school cheaper or we made childcare more affordable. For me, it's the thing that's absent for many of them is the motivation to have kids, that primal, deep motivation that many people have, other people just don't have. And maybe before it wasn't an issue because culturally everybody else was having babies, so they would have babies too. It was expected. It's no longer expected. It's no longer necessarily an overriding cultural norm to have kids. And I wonder, is the welfare policy-driven approach really going to significantly move the needle in that regard? And what are your thoughts?
Well, you just put a rapier through my argument, because it is, in fact, you're correct that places like Denmark have a lot of the policies that I'm talking about and also have a low fertility rate. So you can have all the things that I want and still not convince educated women that the best thing for them to do with their years is to pop out lots of kids. And so around the world, the best predictor of fertility is religiosity and lack of education in women. And since we want those things to increase, it is a rather difficult challenge. But what we do see as a difference between social democratic Europe and the United States is that in the United States, when you have kids, you become miserable. And in Europe, you don't. That parents are maintain the same level of happiness as they had before and after kids were in their house. But in the United States, it's a lot harder when you have kids. So I think at least if we could make it not miserable to be a parent, that would be a wonderful accomplishment.
Maybe not quite as miserable, but yes.
Yeah.
Well, no, thank you so much. That's a really, really helpful If you were here, Jay, I'd take you down the pub afterwards and we'd talk about this as a parent, also as a European and as an American. I would love to talk with you more about that. It's terrific. Thank you, Jay. So one of our earliest presenters is in the Zoom room here. Nathan Miner is an interdisciplinary artist, perceptual augmenter, game changer. Nathan, thank you for coming back. You're an old friend of Long Now Boston. What advice would you give us for where Long Now Boston should be headed in the coming years?
So I'm grateful to be here. And yeah, originally, when first heard about the Long Now coming to Boston, I was very excited. It was during an exhibition I was having titled The Long Now, when the first seeds of the idea started to roll around from Bill's email. It's beautiful to be back a part of it. And, you know, as a fan of big thinking, trying to grapple with these things, there's a theme, something, you know, I've been coming out try to make a difference and provoke people's imagination through artwork, encouraging a kind of working against the limits of the mind. You know, Preston talking about the limits of rationality, but we all put limits on ourselves in terms of what we are willing to accept as possible. And the artwork as a way to expand imagination and to challenge those ideas has been, as you know, a thrust of my interest. Pivoting to game design recently, thinking about how people are spending time, like what kind of, so you can make experiences by making art, but experience design in particular is an interesting way to kind of think about what people are doing and how they're doing it and for what purpose, what are their motivations. And in a course I took last spring called The Psychology of Play, we were discussing motivation a lot, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And I was introduced to the theory of self-determination, which is basically saying that we all need three things to feel like satisfied and competent and engaged. Competence is one of them, autonomy is another, and related. You need to feel related. So, you know, we talk about what kind of policies maybe would be important. I think that can look at this idea of self-determination and think, does this policy support people feeling more autonomous? Does it support them having more competence? And does it support their ability to relate to one another? A lot of the advances in our technology have capacity to relate us in a networked way across the whole globe, but also make us more isolated from each other locally. You know, it's interesting to think about these perspectives. I also came across a new term called distributive cognition. And I think that with Cristina talking about this new level of consciousness, this is on my mind as well, in terms of, you know, thinking about how our habits create the bigger picture. So the habits, the things that we do that we don't even recognize that we're doing, how do those ripple out into the world and actually become the reality, the smallest things that we're not paying attention to? And then how can, culturally, how can we engineer our different kinds of habits? So when the cognition, the process of how we relate, you know, we do this in groups of groups, in nations, all different ways that our thought processes, our cognition is distributed. But for the most part, we haven't really harnessed our creativity to kind of render that in a more deliberate way. So as Cristina said, it's like it's unconscious at that level. Just a crazy swarm, a beast raging around the planet as a species.
I mean, so Nathan, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on a potential direction there? On one hand, I'm hearing you talk about, you know, the technologies of networks and our capacity to connect with sort of the broader mass of humanity. Go back 400 years, you only dealt with people essentially in your village or within, you know, 50 minutes walking distance for much of our lives. And now we're in cities, and even if you're not in cities, you're highly connected with so many other people on the planet. You have those technologies, yet we're also more isolated, you know, and there's all sorts of dysfunction that comes with that too. What do you see as a way forward for maybe utilizing these technologies at our disposal to address this very human need of community and connection, and harnessing our creativity in a way that kind of moves us all forward collectively? Are there obvious routes there that you see ahead of us?
Well, one thing that I've been thinking about is, like, you know, often when we can recognize these huge problems and we want to find policies to address them and kind of huge solutions, but I keep thinking about the individual, how meditation, for example, interoception, mindfulness, how these kinds of practices change the capacity for these solutions to actually emerge. Like, instead of manufacturing a new technology that can save us, or deploying some solution, I guess my provocative idea is that all the solutions are already here, and we're ignoring them by refusing to do the hard work of settling down in our own minds.
Fair enough, fair enough. Nathan, appreciate your insights there. Let's move on lastly to Andy Russell, educator, author, and maintainer. Andy, we heard in June about your efforts to promote the maintenance mindset, and that obviously resonates with passion for long-term thinking. What advice do you have for us? What do you think we should be focusing on going forward here?
Yeah, I mean, what a great conversation. Thank you for including me and for hosting it. With each successive speaker, it's getting trickier and trickier to stay focused, because there's so many good ideas. But in a way, Nathan made my job much easier, because my thoughts fit with his pretty well. I would sum my idea for tonight up as balance, specifically technological balance. We've seen and experienced how pushing frontiers is important and life-saving. So the pandemic is an easy example, and vaccines and treatments are the obvious fruits of technological efforts to push forward. But as we know, beating the pandemic isn't going all in on new technology. It's also about being mindful about old technologies, cloth masks, open windows, clean hands, and the list goes on. So, you know, balance also plays out when we think about the people who do the work. Again, to return to scientists and engineers to make vaccines and treatments and scale them up globally so quickly, it's really remarkable. But Lee and I have also spent a few years now talking about people who we call the maintainers, or under COVID, they've been recast as essential workers. So the people who stock grocery shelves, or measure out prescriptions, or deliver any number of things to our doors, from food to fix-it supplies, like some chimney pipe that I've got in my garage now. So, how do we do this? To restore some balance to a world that seems addicted to individuals running fast and breaking things. To be concrete, it would be to infuse technology and business with an ethic of care. And this would decrease inequality, would increase human dignity, which we've heard about earlier tonight. And it would, I think, help us understand why care workers, who we've heard about tonight, are so important, whether it's people who provide childcare, people who are teachers, people who provide elder care, or any kind of healthcare, from simple routine interactions to life-threatening surgeries. So we'll do well if we cultivate these habits of mind, balance, and care, because they can keep the forces of individualism and growth at bay.
Excellent. No, and I very much appreciate your time, Andy. I did have a follow-up question I wanted to ask you, but I'm also mindful of the clock here as well. We're a little bit over in this part of the program, and so maybe we can get into a follow-up conversation as part of the open part of the evening here as well. But let me move on, Andy. Thank you for your inputs there. So thank you, everybody, who just presented and spoke to us from their experience. There's obviously lots to work on there, lots of ideas for people to think about. We love the optimism, we love the excitement, we love the skepticism sometimes that's expressed there, as well as all the great ideas. Now, let's open the floor here, both in the CIC and also on Zoom. We want to hear your ideas, maybe for things that haven't been mentioned, or maybe things that have been touched on just adjacently, but not really focused on in the discussion. What do you think that we should be focusing on going forward as a community of long now thinkers? Do we have, if you're on the Zoom room, if you're in Zoom, please put your ideas and thoughts into the chat, and we'll be bringing those into the conversation as well. So first, those in the CIC here, are there any suggestions, anything that is on your mind that you didn't hear articulated by our presenters that we think Long Now Boston should be thinking about? Malcolm.
Sorry, I started to respond and I was on mute. I forgot. Yeah, we have some comment to some of those speakers about, and actually, let me open it up to Lee. He's got a couple of comments, and Lee, come off mute and give your response to that.
Yeah, I didn't catch the name of the gentleman who was talking about money and the way governments have responded, but I think Adam Hughes, who's not a kind of full-on modern monetary theorist, but just looking at, federal deficits have not driven inflation the way people thought they were, and most of the data on inflation coming in right now appears that it's not the problem people thought it was a couple months ago, and so I think there's a lot of really important conversations going on around how we can use our monetary systems to drive change. And I think climate change is, using it to push climate change technologies fast is a good way to think about it. So, I mean, I think the take home message is we may need to rethink what our governmental financial systems even are, right? And and COVID, our experience under COVID is yet another example showing us that we can do more than previously we thought we could, because we were working under kind of an old and maybe false paradigm.
Yep. James James Hughes has a counterpoint. Jay, unmute yourself and offer your point here.
Oh, it's not a counterpoint. I think I definitely agree with that last comment about modern monetary theory and the capacity of the state. I think we've been sold a neoliberal bill of goods for the last 50 years. The governments can't do anything right, and governments need to get out of the way and let the free market do everything. And guess what? Doesn't solve a lot of problems, creates a lot of problems. So In terms of industries going bankrupt, I was responding to the comment about the airline industries that I think it would have been interesting if we, for instance, had nationalized the banks after 2008 instead of bailing them out and allowing them to continue to create these unsustainable credit bubbles and economic fluctuations in the world economy. And similarly, I think we need to do a lot of retooling of industry. For instance, airlines, which are one of the major creators of CO2 pollution in the world. So it would have been interesting if we had allowed an airline or two to go bankrupt, bought them, and retooled them as an experiment in how to do Green New Deal technology. But perhaps later we'll see that kind of thing.
Yeah, thanks. Grant, I wanted to cycle back to something that I heard a couple of the speakers talk about, and that is there seems to be a tension between the intrinsic and the extrinsic, and the inner world of the human that in so many ways seems to go wrong, and then we also talk about the external world of the science and technologies, the technologies that are affecting us, that are affecting them. And I thought it was interesting that we had that tension, because it seems like many of the problems we're talking about are related to our internal world and the choices that we're making, our internal motivations. And it appears to me that one of the problems of short-term thinking is that we are driven by external incentives. The external incentives of money, the external incentives of amusements and entertainments, and and that the cacophony of the celebrities and the world of social media, being driven by all those externals and losing touch perhaps with the things that are internal to us. And I don't know if any of the speakers have some additional thoughts about trying to fix the internal human is an interesting conundrum, isn't it?
Well, we've got a few minutes to sort it out. Yeah, we can do that. Do any of our speakers have additional thoughts?
Only to say it's frustrating, as a teacher and as someone who dearly would like college students to do more learning, or to trying to find the trick for them. What's going to spark them to learn about broader subjects, or to really dig into their calculus or physics homework? It's tough, but it is the defining problem. We keep coming back to it.
Yeah, and this gets back to what Cristina was saying earlier about that consciousness. If only we could somehow inculcate a consciousness that is much more attuned to the interconnections globally, much more attuned to the natural world. And how do we start building that consciousness in a world that is so very short-term driven? And I see a comment from somebody about psychedelics, so I guess that's from Jay.
For the evening.
So that comment reminds me also Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, and why you should, or maybe that's the subtext. That the new science of psychedelics, I think, is the actual subtext, subtitle rather. An old friend of mine who is from Japan one time was saying, like, everybody's just so busy. Everybody's, she was advocating people doing a lot less. And when there's so much that we all want to do, and there's so many things that we can see that need to be done, it's hard to kind of relate to that. But it's also taking this perspective, just as a hypothetical. We spend a third of our lives asleep, and the other 16 whatever hours a day kind of driving ourselves crazy, trying to do more than is possible. And not all the solutions are going to come from that. So we might use a lot less energy if we weren't running around so much. We might not take such a toll on our health if we weren't so stressed out. And, you know, there's a lot more to be. The long now also comes one breath at a time, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that reminds me Pascal's quote that all humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. And I think it has to do with this idea of solving our inner conflicts. And I think that's a lot of what the Long Now Foundation is doing. But the way I see this is that we are trying to learn a language when we are almost too old. And somehow I think that it's a language that should be taught when we are very little, right? In schools, like I think in schools, and I was talking before about my students and architecture, how we kind of can start bringing like kind of other ways of dealing with materials, for example. But I think deep at the root is the way we teach our children to relate to the planet, to relate to nature, to be with themselves. And I think all goes to education in the end.
Terrific. Thank you so much. In the interest of time, I want us to move towards the end of this evening's program. But thank you to everybody for their presentations just now. I'd want to, I think, just kind of riffing on what was said there. So often as the speakers were talking, I kept coming back to the term values, whether it's the intrinsic motivations, whether it was the things that kind of motivate us. To me, it's about values and how we articulate those values. And I think of values as we as individuals coming together and creating institutions that express the values that we believe in, so that we can go out and promote those values in the world and hopefully have some kind of an influence, maybe a small influence, maybe a large influence, but it's really through the institutions that we create and we sustain as human beings that those values get communicated out. And if we're not projecting out our values, someone else is projecting their values at us and at our kids and people we care about. So to me, we each have a responsibility to participate in that process of pushing out what we believe are the best values for our planet and for our species. So with that in mind, the institution that I'm particularly involved with, Long Now Boston, would certainly be happy to have anybody either come to our events in the future or volunteer and get involved in some of our programs as well. They're a fascinating group of people. You get to see some of the terrific speakers we get to spend time with as well. And so I very much encourage you, if anybody's interested in getting more involved, please speak with me directly or speak online to any of George or anybody else online who's helping there. So thank you again for what has been a fascinating discussion this evening. It's been great input for Long Now Boston. We obviously have a lot of work ahead of us. But for now, I want to turn things back to Jennifer, who will finish off the evening. But thank you again for everybody's time here tonight. And over to Jennifer.
Well, we have a tradition here at Long Now Boston where we head to the bar at the end of our event to continue the conversation. I love that enthusiasm. But before we do, and that is down at the Shy Bird still, is that correct? Downstairs?
They were serving when I came in.
Just downstairs at the Shy Bird. But before we do, I want to thank Lee, Preston, Andy, Cristina, and Nathan for joining us this evening and seeding the conversation tonight. It was just fantastic. It's wonderful to be here. And thanks to all of you, both in person and in Zoom, for joining us. Thank you, Grant, for doing a fabulous job of hosting. Please join us as a member. As Grant mentioned, I just wanted to personally say that it's just been a pleasure and an honor to work with these people and just so much fun doing these kinds of events. And I've just enjoyed it so much. So if you're interested in volunteering and looking to do something worthwhile, I really encourage you to join us and help us out. For those of you who are leaving us this evening, for those of you at home, thank you very much for joining us.